Good afternoon, evening, or morning, whichever time zone you're in. Welcome to the Salem Literary Festival, now in its 13th year. Hello, everybody. Now I see myself. Good afternoon, morning, or evening, whatever time zone you're in. Welcome, everybody, to the Salem Literary Festival. You may know by now, we're in our 13th year and going strong. Welcome to our panel, which we call So You Want to Be a Mother? We'll be hearing about generations of unfit mothers, a reform school for moms who mess up, and about a beautiful town with a terrible affliction. I'm Diane Stern, and at the end of our panel discussion, of course, we'll try to answer all of your questions, which can be put in the Q&A. If you need closed captioning, there's a CC box on your screen. And an anti-harassment policy is at the top of the chat. We don't anticipate any problems, of course, but it's important to us that everyone feels comfortable. And now to our guests. Alexis Schaitkin is known to fans, including our LitFest 2020 audience, for Saint X, which has been ordered as a series adaptation by Hulu. The Washington Post describes her newest book, Elsewhere, as a chilling, eerily current novel that takes a page from Margaret Atwood to explore society's role in the maternal experience. Her short stories have been anthologized in the Best American Short Stories. Alexis received her MFA in fiction from the University of Virginia, and she now lives in Williamstown, Massachusetts, with her husband and their 2 children. He's not on the panel. Barack Obama chose Jesmyn Chan's The School for Good Mothers for his summer list. Did you see that? The Library Journal's starred review calls it a stunning debut that could not be timelier, leaving no stone unturned in its allusion to the real-life legal assaults that constrain women today. Jesmyn's short stories have appeared in Tin House and Epic. A former reviews editor at Publishers Weekly, she holds an MFA from Columbia and a BA from Brown. Incidentally, oddly enough, both universities briefly appear in her book. Jesmyn lives in Chicago with her husband and daughter. Our moderator joins us from Toronto. Ashley Audrain's The Push was a New York Times, a Sunday Times, and #1 international bestseller, plus a Good Morning America pick. The Push is being developed as a limited TV series. The LA Times praised her nuanced understanding of how women's voices are discounted, how 1,000 little slights can curdle a solid marriage, and how mothers really feel sometimes toward difficult children. Ashley previously worked as publicity director of Penguin Books Canada. She and her partner have 2 young children. So we've established all that you all have kids, and I'm hoping you feel good about that choice. Ashley, over to you.
Thanks so much, Diane.
Thank you, Diane.
Thank you, Diane. Thanks so much. Thank you. Yes, thanks for having us here today at the Salem Lit Fest. I know we're all really happy to be a part of this. These are 2 of my very favorite books. I wish you could see my dog-eared copies of both of them, how many pages I've highlighted and turned the page down on so I could go back to revisit certain passages and chapters again. And of course, this is very much a favorite topic of mine. And so it's really a pleasure to be here with both of you, Alexis and Jesmyn. These 2 books have obviously quite parallel themes, which we'll get into and talking about the books and the mother characters especially. But we're also 3 mothers who are writers or trying to write and trying to promote books. So we'll talk a bit about that as well, just that balance of how this all gets done and what that process is like, and that connection for us between motherhood and writing. And it's funny, as I was thinking sort of in the time kind of leading up to this conversation about sort of the questions that I wanted to ask you both about, it occurred to me that it often feels to me like, and I've found this in events, and I'm sure you have too, or interviews, that mothers who are writers get asked sort of different kinds of questions than fathers who are writers. And usually I'm quite sort of critical of that, or quite sort of, very aware of that as I interview other writers and interviews myself. But today, I think we're giving ourselves permission to throw that out the window and just go there and just talk uninhibited about that, about those two things. So small little disclaimer there to start. But although we'll be keeping today spoiler free when we talk about the plots of your books, I thought we would just start by hearing from both of you just a quick synopsis of what each of your books are about, in case there's anyone joining us who hasn't read them yet. So Jasmine, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thank you to Salem Lit Fest for having us here, and thank you, Ashley, for moderating. It's really a wonderful opportunity to meet you and Alexis, at least virtually. So the School for Good Mothers is about a Chinese-American single mom named Frida Liu, who loses custody of her toddler daughter, Harriet, after having one very bad day. And in order to get her daughter back, she has to spend a year at a newly created government-run reform school where she is re-educated with mothers from across the county. So as you might guess, it is a lighthearted romp, and it's hopefully readers will be following Frida's journey to hold on to her integrity while she's being indoctrinated, as well as her journey to get her child back.
Great. And Alexis, can you tell us about Elsewhere?
First of all, thank you. I'm so excited to be back at Salem Lit Fest. And also, I love both of your books so much. And so this has been like a long awaited treat for me. I'm very excited about it. I told Jasmine and Ashley, everyone else in my family is out of the house, and I'm just very excited to be talking to you both. Elsewhere is a speculative novel that takes the reader to a small, isolated community high in the mountains. You don't know quite where in the world you are. And this is a community that really kind of keeps itself a secret from the rest of the world. Nobody ever leaves, and almost nobody ever comes into this community. And the reason they do that is because something really terrible happens there. And they know that if the rest of the world knew about it, they would never understand why these people have chosen to stay in this town and build their lives there and around this terrible happening, which they call the affliction. And the affliction is that every so often the town will go to sleep in the morning, go to sleep at night, and when they wake up in the morning, a mother will have just disappeared into thin air. They don't know how or really why it happens, but they think that the mothers are chosen because there is something in the way they love their children that is out of balance in some way. Too much of this, too little of that. And so the women in this town, the mothers in this town, really live under a constant sort of regime of scrutiny and surveillance and self-surveillance. And our narrator, Vera, is a teenager when the novel begins, and she kind of takes the reader on her journey from girlhood to, coming of age, getting married, and ultimately becoming a mother herself and being faced with this question of, is she going to be able to stay and mother her child, or is she going to disappear?
Thank you. Yeah. I just want to pause just to mention, I forgot to mention off the top, for people who are watching, please go ahead and submit your questions at any time, and we'll address them as we go, and we'll address them at the end too. So thanks for those introductions. And of course, both of your novels are very haunting. They're books that really, that sort of haunting feeling stays with you. And I think because of that speculative element that you both have, and speculative elements feel so real, and a little maybe too close to reality. And that's, I think, what part of what makes your books, so unique, of course, but is kind of that marriage between, those speculative elements and motherhood, which is, you don't see that too often. And I wondered what it was about that, marriage that interested you so much as writers. Like, why did you want to kind of combine that topic with sort of taking a piece of that genre into what you created?
Alexis,
yeah. Okay. I know we're all going to defer to each other the whole time. Actually, that's such a good question. I think for me, what was so interesting and appealing about writing about motherhood through a speculative story was that it kind of let me do two things that are somewhat at odds with each other at the same time, which is like, I really wanted to write about motherhood. I wanted to write about these internal struggles of, that I was so interested in about, how selfless should a mother be? How selfish should a mother be? When you feel your identity changing as a mother, are you discovering something about yourself? Are you losing yourself? Like, how do you know? And just kind of, and I was so interested in getting into like the weird particularity of a mother-child relationship and all of those things. But I also like spent all day taking care of kids. And so I wanted to write about all these things, but the idea of spending my writing time writing about like screen time or like all of the like minutia of the everyday, I just felt like I couldn't do it. And so I think for me, and Jasmine, it might be a little different for you because mine is set in a kind somewhat more like fantastical, like less our contemporary world context. But I think for me, it was like this ability to have something that's both an escape and that still lets you kind of explore motherhood and these big questions about it. But yeah, like in a setting that feels like like I'm being transported, and hopefully like the reader is also being transported somewhere that's a little different from this kind of like everyday world that I was spending all of my hours in.
Yeah, I can see. Yeah, so I can see how you would sort of felt that one step removed, which gives you a bit of freedom too. I think there's a bit of freedom in kind of writing that way, and it's so interesting that Elsewhere really feels very free of a time period. Like we don't quite know when it is placed, and we don't quite know where it is placed, and there's you're right, a certain kind of license that you had to play with there because of that, which was really interesting because you could really get in on the core emotion of some of that motherhood experience without all of everything around it that we deal with every day, like you said.
Yeah, like I feel like there's some of it is still in there, but it was like I was able to invent different I don't know, like even just like if a kid is eating a different kind of food than like the Dino chicken nuggets that my kid always wants me to make for him, there's something a little bit liberating about getting to change it a little bit.
Well, that's interesting. And Jasmine, what about you?
So it's an interesting question because I started the book several years before getting pregnant. So in a way, the book was based on a crazy idea from one really good writing day. So I've never had a writing day like that. I just need it to happen more than once in my life. So it was the case that I ended up like writing for 6 hours in a trance, like the kind of day you always want to have when you sit down to work. And as a result of that day's messy drafting, it was basically the foundation for the book. So I had Frida and Harriet's whole story from start to finish, and the school and the voice and the instructors and the secondary characters. So I thought I was writing just a very complicated, dense short story. Like I was working on a short story collection at the time, and I did not dare say like, oh, I think I've started a novel. Because that's a daunting prospect. But I think that the speculative element partly grew out of the fact that one of the kernels of inspiration was the Rachel Aviv article in the New Yorker called "Where Is Your Mother?" from late 2013. And when I read that piece, I didn't have a notebook with me saying this might be the catalyst for a big creative project that will take years of my life. It was more that something about that mother story just stuck with me, and it really planted a kernel of rage in my mind, because it's about a single mom who left her toddler son at home, and after that day never got him back. And so I think the way it was portrayed, so, and also she's a non-native English speaker, and so it felt like she was being subjected to this really American standard of parenting, and also that there was so much subjectivity, like on the part of the social worker and the family court judge, but these people who have so much power can change a family's life forever. And so that really stuck with me and I think haunted me for many months, and I think grew into this project. But so there are two threads of inspiration. One was the nonfiction piece that I had read, and also a lot of my own ambivalence about becoming a mom. I was in my mid-30s. It was time to choose a path. I didn't feel ready, but like time pressure is what it is for women's biology. So I would have happily waited until I was 55 to have a baby, and that's just not how it works. So I had this time pressure that it felt like it was bearing down on me. So I was thinking a lot about motherhood. And I think the speculative element partly grew out of the fact that when I read that New Yorker article, part of it felt like science fiction because they talked about parenting and mothering and love in such a clinical way, like as if that those are things that can be measured. And I mean, it's a bit of a logical leap to go from that chilly tone to what it became in my book, but I think I was responding to things in the culture, and I was responding to questions I had about the pressure that mothers are under.
Well, it's interesting because I mean, if you were to just, go into your book having only knowing about, the flat copy or the summary of what it was about, you think you're getting into something that actually feels quite speculative, like quite different than reality. But when you're reading the book, there is this sense of it not being that far off from a place that we could very easily be. And I think that was what, I mean, it is speculative, but it is, I think, the reason it is as affecting as it is because it's not that far off from, I think, where some days it feels like we are going, despite there's that quality to it, which is really remarkable, definitely. And I wanted to talk about sort of tension as a follow-up to that. I think as writers, we're probably always thinking about tension, right? Like, how do you create tension in work? And then as a reader, I'm always kind of reading with an eye to that tension. And I thought a lot about that reading both of your novels because there's this steady beat of tension in both novels. And I think I was trying to decide, where it really came from. And I think it is tied to that speculative element in a sense that you are trying to imagine, what it would be like to be Vera or to be Frida the whole time. And then of course there's this anticipation of, for Vera, will she go and when? And then for Frida, will she get her daughter back and when and how? And so, these aren't thrillers, of course, we sort of think more traditionally about thrillers needing to be tense, but there is such high emotional suspense in both. And I wondered about how you achieved that, or were you quite aware of that or quite conscious of that, trying to inject that tension in it? Or do you think it was kind of just more inherent in the story you were writing?
So I think for me, I always feel when I'm writing like I think with this novel, I had a sense from the very beginning that the kind of driving source of tension. I mean, there's a few things. There's a kind of like, what is going on with this affliction? Why are these mothers disappearing? What's happening? But that it really was to kind of create this whole speculative community, but that Vera was the heart of this story. And that I wanted to try to write, I always feel like the only way that you can write something that's relatable to other people is by writing something that's very particular and very specific. And so I really felt like the heart of this story was just Vera's relationship with her daughter, Iris, and this kind of strange world that I think parents and children inhabit together that's very private. And I think that I'm getting a little far afield from your question, but like the thing that's always so another kind of tension for me about motherhood is that it's both this kind of public role that is very much judged and scrutinized and kind of turned into symbols of all different, of purity, of all of these things. And then like the meat of it, the hours and hours of it is this time with your child that is this like strange little landscape between the two of you or the three of you or however many kids that nobody outside of it can really understand. And so I think for me, the sense of suspense and tension kind of hopefully grows naturally out of getting to really feel like you understand this one relationship and then see what happens when there's the potential of that relationship being broken off. When Vera, hopefully for me, it's like if the reader can really see what makes the two of this mother-daughter pair click and tick and be at odds with each other and all of that, then when Vera is kind of considering the possibility that she might disappear and lose this relationship and And what does that mean? And, you know, faced with that possibility, do you stay until the last possible moment to be with your child as long as you possibly can, even though you might just completely lose yourself? Or do you try to escape somehow and preserve yourself but lose your child? So I think for me, I was just really focused on their relationship and then kind of making Vera face this sort of reckoning, which is very speculative, but I think relates to all kinds of questions that mothers in our own world, you know, both very real questions about children being separated from parents, but also questions about like identity and how much of yourself do you kind of keep to yourself from your child, or how much do you just kind of give your life over? Yeah, so I think for me, it was just the combination of these characters and those questions, and then a kind of inflection point where Vera has a choice to make.
Well, it's done so well, done so brilliantly. And Jasmine, how about you? Did you think a lot about tension?
I have a far less lucid response because I feel like I feel like I'm still pretty new to novel writing, and like I mean I'm probably not even supposed to say this publicly, but I don't think about structure and theme at all when I work. And I'm someone who really likes to produce the big, baggy, messy draft and then cut it. So that's like the most inefficient way to work ever, because I write longhand and then I type it up and then I cut it, and it takes like 3 times longer. But it's the slowest way you could possibly work. But I was thinking about tension, not just on the like structure plot level, but I was trying to cut the individual lines and paragraphs so that it had I was going for like a la fun with Dick and Jane sort of pacing from one line to the next, so that it wasn't just the momentum of what was happening in the plot, but like the movement from one line to the next and from one paragraph to the next, to keep the reader going, because I knew that I was leading the reader to hard places and it wasn't necessarily like toward joy. So I figured like it would be, I figured that in the cutting of the lines and like the transitions between the scenes, like that itself, like the language and the rhythm had to be a hook to keep people turning the pages, because what was happening in the story was pretty dark. So I was trying to think about it like on the line level.
Interesting. Well, I think too, yeah, I can see that. And I think for both of you too, like there is that, just because of what you're writing about and that darkness that you touched on, Jasmine, you both write about mothers who disappear in some way, right? And both are effectively sort of erased as well. At some point, we talk about mothers sort of being erased in both scenarios as well. Sorry, I'm dancing around my words because I don't want to give too much away for people that haven't read them. But I think there's it's very powerful to read both stories, because I think that is the greatest fear of a mother, right? Like there's fear plays such a big role in this too, in terms of like the darkness and the tension and everything we're writing about. The greatest fear I think of most mothers is not being there, having to leave or dying, or leaving, not being there with our kids. And having to, as you read, kind of having to imagine what that goodbye would feel like, or what that separation would feel like. And you both write about that so beautifully and so powerfully. In a way, it kind of, I think as a mother reading it, it sort of borderlines on like the experience of reading horror in a way, like it really is that visceral, that feeling. And it sort of made me wonder, and I've got this question too about the push, and I want to ask it of you. But like, why do we write about this worst case scenario motherhood? Like, why do we? Is it because we're trying to maybe confront that fear and anxiety in ourselves? Is it because it's this place that that you kind of dare to go, like it's really, you're sort of daring yourself to go there? So I guess I pose that to both of you, like why write about that experience, that heavy fear that we all have?
Oh, I'm just gonna jump in and say as you were talking, I was thinking, like, if a book club assigned all 3 of our books, like 3 months like back to back and like served really delicious, comforting food, that would make for a very interesting season of reading. Because your book does that too. It confronts like the most primal fears, and it also like touches on like feminist horror also and psychological horror too. So for me, I was really afraid of having a baby. So a lot of my anxieties like fed into the book. And then once I actually had my daughter, I felt like all the harder, more stressful feelings had somewhere to go because of the particular project that I was working on. And I was asked at an event yesterday, like, how did I keep my morale up while working on such a dark book? But I was working on it during her infancy and toddlerhood. And so as I was rewriting the book to reflect like my actual experience of motherhood, and I was writing about loss and the horror of the government taking your child away, which is like the greatest nightmare for a lot of us to even think about. I spent my day writing my quite dark book, and then I spent my afternoons taking my toddler to the playground. So there are just a lot of strange things like in juxtaposition in my life at the time. But I find that motherhood is full of fear and anxiety. I mean, partly from our culture, like you're kind of inundated with danger, like from the minute you get pregnant. Like there are all these things you're not supposed to do. There's so many instructions. It feels like you're always making the wrong choice, and it feels like anything you can do stepping outside of the house or even in your house like is harming your baby in some way. So it feels like the biggest responsibility, but also it just feels like you're on a tightrope the whole time. So it was for me helpful to explore that in fiction.
I agree with you.
No, I was just going to say, I think it's really interesting because like Ashley, you started with this question of like, okay, the greatest fear about motherhood is being separated from your child. And Jasmine, you went to what I think is like the other great fear, and they're kind of like at odds, but also linked, which is the fear that like you will mess it up while you're with the child. And I think for me, like that was like trying to hold both of those together, I guess, was what was so like is what's so interesting and challenging about parenthood, and what I really was trying to like get onto the page was simultaneously the experience of just like you love this child so much, and the thought of being separated from them and not getting to be there and raise them is just unimaginably painful. But also like every moment you're with them, you kind of feel like you're like, maybe you're messing it up, or I don't know. I guess I think one of the things that's so interesting to me, like all three of our books are, I think, in a way trying to confront like the inevitable imperfection of any parent, right? Like everyone is going to do something bad. Everyone's going to have a very bad day, or something that they've inherited from their parents and their grandparents that's just part of their personality that they're going to impart to their children, no matter how much they love them, that is harmful. Like there's no way, I think, for a parent-child relationship to like evade those imperfections, those pitfalls, those harms. And like I think for me, the thing that was so scary to kind of think about and write about is the experience of like loving someone so much and wanting them to just have like the perfect mother, but also like knowing that no matter what, you're not it. Like it's just, and you don't, but it's very hard to know, you know, what is it that my child is going to think of this relationship that we have. So I think just holding those together, like both the complete terror of like that hypothetical of losing your child, but also the question of like, while I'm with my child, even though I love them so much, am I messing it up somehow? And also just the knowledge that like, yes, you are probably.
Yeah, inevitable. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you do that so well through the, like, because that's kind of what this touches on, the whole concept in your book of the affliction, right? Which is, as you mentioned, this thing that this sort of out of balance way that the mother is mothering their child, and everyone's sort of watching the mothers with judgment, trying to kind of see what their affliction will be. What are they doing that's slightly wrong or slightly off balance? And that, of course, that whole idea is very much a premise in A School for Good Mothers. but you really get at that idea of, you know, a mother's love for their child, even with the best intentions, being this kind of like wildly dangerous thing at the same time, you know, that both of those things exist together. And there's a line that I loved in Elsewhere where you were talking about the afflictions, and this is from Vera's perspective, and she's saying, we wanted to inhabit the full body of our affliction, to feel all the inches of its power and our vulnerability to it, but we also wanted to be spared. So there's this idea that they, and I think we, so many of us as mothers can relate to that feeling, you know, you want to feel it, you want to be wholly present in it, and you also want to be spared from it at moments, you know, because it does have this dangerous quality to it that is that you both write about so beautifully in your books. So we talked a bit. Someone has asked a great question of you, Jasmine, about sort of this, you know, we're talking a lot about this dark side and kind of writing through these fears and anxieties of motherhood. And sometimes it does feel quite relentless, you know, I think, and I've had that comment a lot about The Push too. It's just sort of this, you're kind of going towards a place where you know, really want to feel lighter and hope, and readers, you know, at times might not find that. It can, you know, can end in kind of a darker place. And it, you know, the endings of both of your books are so affecting, and just, I mean, I think you mentioned this in an email that we had going, Alexis, about you just sobbed through the end of, or I think we've all sobbed through the end of A School for Good Mothers. Yeah. That last chapter is pretty remarkable, and I felt the same sort of heaviness at the end of Elsewhere, in a different sense. And there was certain sentences, one sentence in particular that it just, I could think of it and cry. It's so good. And I sort of wondered about, do you feel, this is kind of more of a writer question, but do you feel that sadness as you are writing? And do you let yourself feel that sadness, or do you feel like, does that come into play, or do you feel a little more like you're a puppeteer and you are, you know, making these emotions happen? I'm just curious about how that is emotionally for you in the actual writing process, and how you.
Such a good question, and I can see both of us kind of pausing to try to figure out the answer.
Part of it is jogging the memory, because I started the project in 2014, and so it is very possible that I got very sad while drafting the first draft. But I think in pandemic time, it feels like I'm telling about 30 years ago. But it's been like so moving to hear about everyone really feeling the feelings in my book, because I'm not someone who cries that much while reading, and I think it's because I'm on really powerful antidepressants. so like I get crying adjacent feelings, but I like it's like every like 5 years or so that like actual tears come. But I think it was, my husband would tell you that whenever I got to chapters 16, 17, 18 in that stage of revision, that I would get very grouchy, stop sleeping, get very agitated and difficult to be around, because I was really like in it, like trying to access those feelings. And it is getting to a very like dark, raw place. But I will just jump in and say there is some humor in the book too. There really is. The marketing in the book is not like humor forward, but I think that the sources of joy, I have a note on my bulletin board that says like joy and wonder are possible even if the subject is very dark. And I was hoping that the joy and wonder would be like in the language and imagery, even if what was happening to the characters was grim. But I've been thinking lately, because the book is a somber book, but I don't know that it could be anything else, because I mean the real life tragedy of the government taking a parent's child away, like that happens to thousands of families like every year, and sometimes in ways that are like dramatically unjust. And so I don't know that there's a way to inject more lightness to something that really does happen.
Yeah, I mean, I similarly to Jasmine, I feel like I had that, you know, when people have told me like, oh, I cried at the end, I'm always really relieved in a way, because I just feel like, you know, you put this world on paper and you spend years on it, and on every single sentence. but it's still sort of a kind of magic to me that other people read it and feel like they're reading a real novel or something.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I guess some of that is imposter syndrome, but some of it is just that, like, for me, as like, I think for the author, this whole world exists in your mind in such an expansive way, and then it's like all the reader gets is like these 220 pages, which are ideally like a real distillation of that world. But it's always kind of a relief and a wonder to me when people like read the book and feel like Vera is real and this relationship is real and immersive, right? But I think like I tend to run kind of like low emotionally naturally. And so I cry a lot of commercials, but not a lot of other content. I don't know why that is, but like really sentimental commercials. But I often feel like I often feel like I'm putting in those really intense scenes, and then I'm like, okay, I have to go back to this later and kind of like really get there. And with Elsewhere, just the timeline of it, I had like a kind of first composed draft that my editor read when I was 7 months pregnant with my younger child. And I spent those last 2 months just racing to revise it. And then I did the final, like I basically like got to the end a second time, and like my water broke that night, and I sent it to my editor. And then the final kind of couple rounds of revision I did when my daughter was kind of newborn to 3 months old. And so I do remember like one moment where I was looking at like a very emotionally intense moment for Vera, and a kind of a moment where she really felt like maybe she was on the verge of disappearing, and kind of thinking about everything she wasn't going to be there to kind of do or smooth the way for her daughter, or like be with her daughter, and just kind of like writing that while my daughter was in a little bassinet next to me, and actually crying, but like not typically. So I'm sure that was sort of like new baby stuff. But yeah, I don't know. I just always, obviously it's the goal of spending like however many years writing a novel that people read it and they feel like it's real and the world is real and they care about it. But it always still feels like magic to me that it actually happened.
Yeah, I agree.
But don't you get a lot of questions? I mean, for all three of us, like, what do you want readers to experience from the book? And like I get the question, like, what do you want readers to take away? And like, there's a bunch of things I want readers to take away, but I want readers to be moved most of all.
Yeah.
Like just even like fully invest and be present in the experience of reading the book feels like a big ask in today's world.
Well,
Totally.
and I also think, you know, that they're all books, and I think, you know, there's obvious, like with both of our kind of speculative novels, like there's obviously these critiques of or connections to things in like our own world. But I don't know, for me, it's like I wanted the reader to be obviously thinking about that, but not necessarily spending all their time drawing one-to-one correspondences between this detail in the novel and like this thing in our own world. Like I do hope that people can surrender a little bit to the story and kind of like, feel the story, and not only be looking for those kind of like connections.
Parallels. I agree. Yeah. And sort of speaking of that, I think, you know, something I wanted to ask you both about or chat about is, I guess, this idea of, you know, compulsory motherhood. You know, this idea that as young girls, you know, I think quite young, we sort of learn to consider ourselves maternal, consider ourselves as maternal beings, right? Even just the way we are taught and think about our biology, and the way, you know, our identity from such an early age is very much tied to that experience of being or going to become a mother. And I think somewhere along the lines for a lot of us, and I feel very much the way you described feeling, Jasmine, about it feels like it kind of goes from this kind of expectation as a woman to kind of this obligation as a woman to then, and there are a lot of conflicting feelings for a lot of women around that. You both talk about that, you know, in your books in some way. I right from the very beginning, I think it's the first chapter and elsewhere, you know, in its opening scenes, we see the little girls playing with dolls in a certain way, and kind of, and it's because they know that in their society, you know, reproducing as a woman is one of the most celebrated and respected things that you can do. And of course, that's a major premise, a major part of the premise in A School for Good Mothers, in a sense that, you know, if you are not maternal enough, if you are not good enough at that job, then you are rehabilitated essentially by the government. And I wondered if you could speak a bit about, you know, just what your relationship to that idea is. You know, is that I know, sorry, I don't know if you have a daughter, Alexis, or if both of your kids are son. You do. Yeah. So we all have daughters. I know Jasmine, our daughters are the same age, or 5 years old, same as Alexis. So I'm sure you think about that a lot as a mother, like I do, in terms of, you know, the language you use and how you speak to your children. So can you talk a bit about that? And maybe Jasmine, you can go first, just talking a bit about how that played into what was on your mind when you were writing the book, or how you think about your work.
Yeah, I certainly spent most of my 20s and early 30s wanting to be a Johnny Awful style art monster. Like in Department of Speculation, she talks about the concept of the art monster. That was the life I wanted. I said, I'm never going to get married, never going to have a kid. I'm just going to write. Like, I don't want anything else to get in my way, because I mean, the message that I got growing up was that I feel like, so this is kind of circular, but like when I feel like growing up as a kid in the 80s, the message was like, can women have it all? And I feel like the message now is that you're supposed to be like a career woman and a domestic goddess and like 100% perfect mom. So it's actually like more pressure than the world my mom was entering, as someone who was working full time. And I feel like I don't actually know what the world my daughter will enter will be like, but I mean, it is very sobering to hear her at age 5.5 talk about her future baby and when she's going to be. I really blame Disney because she's like, I feel like when we were raising her in West Philly, she was getting like kind of a more progressive, like less traditional like concept of gender, like way of looking at the world. And I feel like now that she's been exposed to some like pop culture stuff, she wants to grow her hair to the ground like the Disney princesses, and like wants to just wear like princess unicorn fairy type stuff, and like is already plotting her future as a mom, which is great if she wants to do that. But it's really interesting seeing how little has changed in the culture as opposed to like 40 years ago when I was growing up. And I guess I thought there would be more progress. Like, I mean, I don't know that anyone who is like in their 20s in the 90s would look at what's happening now and think like, wow, things have gotten so much better. Like, I think that's what's really sobering about raising a girl these days.
I think so too. What do you think, Alexis?
Well, it's interesting because I had almost like an opposite experience to Jasmine. It was like I was that little girl who was like always had a list in my head of the names I would name my kids, and it was like, you know, I obviously always wanted to. Not obviously always wanted to be a writer, but I always wanted to be a writer, and but I kind of like held both of them like equally in my mind, and then, you know, we had a lot of trouble having kids, and I remember like years of just being like, is this ever going to happen, and desperately wanting it. And then I had my son and I was like, oh my gosh, like, I'm not sure I actually do. You know, I had that experience of like, I always thought this was the thing I wanted more than anything else. And then I had just like an incredibly hard adjustment to motherhood and a feeling of like, oh my gosh, was I completely wrong? I just felt so resistant to the degree to which like my life wasn't mine anymore, which of course is something that everybody tells you, but like is not something I don't think, or at least I could understand before it happened. The degree to which my like mental space was kind of invaded, the degree to which like your body isn't, you know, it's like I loved nursing, but it, you know what I mean? The degree to which your body isn't yours and is changed. And so I think that, you know, that was kind of part, and you talked about compulsory motherhood. And I think for me, you know, I think second kid was a totally different story, much much easier adjustment. But I think for me, like becoming a mother of like a much wanted child and realizing what an incredibly hard time I had, I think just like further cemented for me the idea that like, no, you know what I mean? That like nobody should ever be meant to feel or physically to be forced to become a mother unless it's
Mhm.
that they really want to and feel prepared to do. And yeah, I mean, I think I feel, you know, I know Jasmine was just saying like things seem to not have progressed that much. And in a way I am really scared about like what world, you know, my daughter's one, like what is the world going to be like for her when she's 20?
Mm.
You know, I think Roe v. Wade was repealed like 4 days before my book came out. So I certainly didn't write it as an allegory about reproductive rights, but it is a book where, you know, the minute a woman becomes pregnant, becomes a mother, she faces this like complete existential threat. And you know, I mean, I think all of our books are really trying to capture the degree to which, you know, motherhood and raising a child is kind of full of wonder and fascination and also terror. And yeah, that was a little
Mhm.
rambling, but
No,
Well,
it's very
oh,
relevant. Mhm.
yeah, Roe v. Wade was overturned when I was at an artist residency, and I feel like that really affected what I ended up drafting, like while I was there, just because we were all like trauma bonding and trying to process
Mm.
what's happening.
And Diane, I see you're back. Do we have time for a few more questions, or are we?
Yes, you absolutely do. And I have a couple of quick ones also. So go ahead.
Sure. Well, I wanted to ask, I guess, sort of there's 1,000 things I want to ask you, but I will I will close my questions with you talked a bit about, or since we're on the topic of kind of that writing about motherhood as mothers and kind of becoming a mother and wanting to be a writer and going through this experience of having young kids. Jasmine, I heard you say on a podcast something that I thought was so smart, which I think you were recounting advice that you had given other writers who were talking about becoming a mothers. And you said you'll never have enough time to write anymore if you become a mother, but you will have material for the rest of your life.
Oh,
And I thought that was so, I mean, couldn't capture it better. That basically sums it up, doesn't it? Because it does. It gives you this kind of different inspiration in your writing and things that you want to write about. So I think that's pretty applicable. But one thing, a really important thing that I want to bring up is childcare. And I feel like I noticed in both of your acknowledgements, and it was important for me to do in my book as well, is you acknowledged the people that helped you care for your children while you were writing. And we don't always see that. We don't always hear about how these books get written while raising families and having a young kid. And so I wanted to just say, you know, kudos to you for doing that. And also if you can just talk a bit like about what is that process? Like, how do you get the book done? And you know, how it's not, I know for me, it was never writing during nap time. Like that was not a concept that applied to my life at all. And so can you speak a bit about that?
Oh, do you want to? Oh, okay. I'll
go
take
ahead,
it.
go ahead.
So the acknowledgements for my daughter's nannies and babysitters, it looks really long and it looks like she had like 4 nannies at a time, but it was more that in one summer, sometimes she had 4 nannies in one summer, just because you're constantly cobbling stuff together. And I mean, I'm amazed hearing about Alexis writing while very pregnant, writing with a newborn, because my brain was not actually working during those months. And I was just kind of, yeah, just trying to deal with like the anxiety of pregnancy and new motherhood. So the fact that you were able to like create art during that time is amazing. And I've been trying to be vocal about the fact that my book got done because of childcare and because I had the resources to afford childcare. And I mean, I just feel like this would be a really different society if things were more like they were in Canada. I know that like, all Canadians are like, it's not perfect here, but to Americans, it looks really much better. And if there was affordable childcare, if there was more family leave, if like preschool was paid for, I mean, those things I think would make art making and most mothers' careers much more possible. So I was able to get the book done because of supportive partner, like my parents helping out, and then also having money for childcare and like having really nice, devoted people like taking care of my daughter.
I know we're getting close on time, but I would, absolutely echo everything Jasmine said. I mean, I think it was in both books, like you always think about writing your acknowledgements. And the thing I was the most excited about was like to thank the people who took care of my children while I was working, because it's like, otherwise it doesn't happen. It doesn't exist. And then this book, though, a lot of it was written during like COVID lockdown. Because I had a deadline, right? And that, it was a deadline, and it was a real deadline. And so I don't think I would have thought that I could do it if I didn't have a deadline. But I do feel like one thing I really learned with this book is just like, I've always had all these ideas about like the kind of extended time you need to like get deep and write. And like, when this was just like, all right, well, what I have is 5:30 to 8:30 in the morning, like, and the rest of the, like, then I think it kind of taught me, it taught me something I don't ever want to do again, but like, but it did teach an important lesson about like, if you're just not precious about the circumstances you need, then like, you can get maybe more done than you would have thought.
I think all of us, go ahead, Ashley.
No, I was just going to point out a really funny question that could have a very quick answer from Joyce in the audience, who said, speaking of preserving that special mother-child bond, how old do you think your children will be before you'd allow them or encourage them to read your books?
I have a
great
funny
question,
anecdote.
Joyce.
So I'm hoping, well, I mean, I can't really stop her when she's old enough to read I feel like my daughter is very cunning, and she will like sneak into my office and take books when she's old enough. I mean, she's only 5.5 now, so she's just starting to learn to read. But my funny answer to that is my daughter has been announcing to people, like to other moms at her school. And like, we went to a book festival yesterday, and like, she announced this to a friend of mine. She's like, you're the mommy in the book and I'm the baby in the book. I'm like, I really don't want you to tell people that, but I think it hasn't clicked yet that like my love for her can be the inspiration, but this is not actually our stories, because she will have a lot to say when she finally leaves.
Yeah. I took my son to a reading that I did recently. I'll also just close on a funny little anecdote. And I thought he was just gonna kind of not be listening and zone out. But at the end, when it was time for the Q&A, he like shot his hand in the air. And he's usually very shy, but he just stood up and he said, Mommy, all that speech that you just said, what did any of it mean? I feel like I have time before he could read it and make any sense of it.
I love that. So good.
So I just want to ask one quick question. We have to get out momentarily, but Ashley, in your writing of The Push, did you have the 1950s movie The Bad Seed in mind at all?
So I didn't, and I didn't really know what The Bad Seed was, to be honest, to be totally honest, until after I wrote it. I still haven't watched the movie or read it, but people ask me that often. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that is all the time that we have. It's been a terrific and a candid panel, I might add. Thanks to Alexis Shakin, Jasmine Chan. I listened to you on Audible. It was fabulous. Your narrator was just great. And our moderator, Ashley Audrain. And I thank you to the Salem Athenaeum for presenting the Lit Fest, and to our audience, of course, including my daughter in New York. And you can buy these books at Wicked Good Books in Salem, Mass, Copper Dog Books in Beverly, Massachusetts, or bookshop.org. Coming up next, Cozy Up Comfort Reads. Check out the rest of our schedule at salemlitfest.org. Okay. See you all, and thank you so much. This is great.